Senior lexicographer Elara Vance pressed her stylus against the data slate, recording the impossible. Hive Spire. Morteus's mid-level had ceased all Vox traffic for exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes, yet power consumption had tripled. The numbers refused to reconcile, a heretical paradox that made her teeth ache with more than just the strange subsonic vibration thrumming through the rockcrete walls. Arbitrator Caney, confirm readings, she spoke into the crackling Vox as their team entered the transit cradle. The mag brakes whispered them upward through the spire's throat, past gantries and ladder wells that stretched into darkness above and below like the ribs of some vast, sleeping beast. Chronometer shows 8:15, lexicographer, came Caney's flat response, his carapace armor gleaming dully in the lumen strips. But the wall display here reads 1942 tomorrow. Tech adept Zephyr's augmetic eye whirred as she processed environmental data, her mechadendrites twitching with nervous energy. Temporal displacement confirmed across multiple measurement nodes. Environmental systems report nominal function, yet atmospheric composition tastes of copper and ozone. The air grew thick as they ascended, metallic and medicinal, wrong in ways that bypassed rational analysis. Guardsman Morvek shifted his autogun, veteran instincts prickling at the unnatural silence that had replaced the hive's familiar thrum. The usual cacophony of millions, manufactorum grind, grav vehicle shriek, the endless murmur of human existence, had vanished, leaving only this almost sound that nested behind their ears and shook enamel. Temperature readings fluttered like startled birds as they reached the Mechanicus facility. 15 degrees variance within 3 meters, Zephyr's instruments insisted, though the environmental systems purred in perfect rhythm. The corridor opened into chambers where chronometers betrayed them at every turn. Wall dials frozen 6 minutes ahead, wrist chronos ticking backward with patient certainty, console clocks insisting it was yesterday noon. In the facility's main refectory, they found the first true impossibility. Tables arranged in precise geometric patterns, hexagons within pentagrams within circles that hurt to look at directly. Each held meals that should have been cold for hours, yet steam still rose from bowls of protein paste and synth calf. The spacing was constant to 1,000th, orientation favoring Hive North with mathematical precision. Recent abandonment, Caney observed, his voice carefully flat, but the food remains warm. A geometry of insistence, Elara murmured, logging the phrase because it fit and disturbed her. The patterns seemed to wait, as if arranged not by fleeing personnel, but by something that understood the value of precise presentation. They climbed deeper into the hive's vertical maze, where corridors became ribs and gantries, crossed voids like notes on an impossible staff. Pict feeds flickered alive as they passed, showing them walking before they arrived, then failing when they did. The claustrophobic verticality pressed down, not narrowing walls, but the absence of endpoints, where up offered no destination and down promised no escape. The Mechanicus gate bore the split cog and skull, runes glowing health green, but refused entry until Zephyr fought a logic knot that had tied itself. Inside, cogitators purred in idle cycles, screens spooling equations that reached no conclusion. Work slates listed procedures paused mid-step, revised in red pen along margins. Silence protocols appeared thrice, underlined, then vanished when touched. At the maintenance access points, they found the true horror. Heavy plasteel hatches sealed not with Imperial materials, but with organic resin, amber black and glossy, rippled and layered as if poured and grown. The substance bound hatch to frame with biological certainty, sweet at the edge, rancid at the heart, like fruit abandoned under a sun that forgot evening. Sealed from inside the shaft, Zephyr confirmed, scraping the resin with a singing blade. Threads stretched like sinew before snapping with wet clicks. Organic polymers, chitinous inclusions, not Mechanicus grade. Her auspex pressed against the seam produced readings that made reality stutter. The display fuzzed to static rain, collapsed, returned as impossible script. At the fourth sealed hatch, the instrument pinged in a tone none had heard before. Massive biosignatures directly above them clustered like sleeping leviathans within what should have been solid rockcrete. "Multiple entities," Zephyr whispered, her voice barely audible above the intensifying thrum. "Immense, moving through structural elements that should be impermeable." The subsonic vibration deepened until thoughts stumbled across its surface. Pressure waves rose and fell like slow surf, and Alara realized with growing horror that the sound wasn't mechanical, it was organic, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something vast and patient that had been waiting in the walls of Hive Spire Mortius far longer than 4 hours and 17 minutes. Caney lifted his maul. Morvek watched the ceiling. The Auspex painted impossible masses above them, breathing things dwelling in stone. Ilara set the time in her log, though her chronometer now claimed it was somehow 3:33, and prepared to document whatever truth lay beyond the silence protocols. The Auspex's final ping echoed in Ilara's mind as she closed the device, its impossible readings of massive biosignatures dwelling within solid rockcrete still burning behind her eyes. The subsonic thrum had deepened during their investigation, and now it seemed to pulse with deliberate rhythm, as if something vast and patient had begun to stir within the spire's bones. "The population didn't vanish," she said, studying the scuff marks and footprints that led consistently upward through maintenance corridors. They ascended. The trail told its story in the language of orderly exodus. Boot prints and bare feet, all oriented toward vertical access points, spaced with the precision of a parade formation rather than the chaos of panic. Personal belongings lay scattered along the path, but not dropped in haste, arranged with surgical care into patterns that made Ilara's vision blur when she tried to comprehend their geometry. In the first Hab unit, they found the mandala. A child's toy Aquila sat at the precise center of a spiral drawn in food paste across the floor, its wings aligned to mathematical principles that hurt to perceive directly. 7 primary arms radiated outward, each subdivided into 3 secondary branches, 11 tertiary points, and 19 final terminals that seemed to twist beyond the confines of the room's dimensions. Personal effects surrounded the pattern, family pics arranged at exact intervals, clothing sorted by color gradients that created spectrums painful to follow, cutlery and plates positioned to create sightlines that converged on empty air. "Geometry of insistence," Ilara murmured, logging the phrase because it captured something essential about the arrangements. These weren't random patterns, but deliberate constructions that demanded attention while resisting comprehension. Morvek shifted uneasily beside a wardrobe where children's clothes hung in order of increasing size, each garment precisely spaced. "Feels like they're still watching," he muttered, autogun cradled defensively. The family shrine in the next Hab unit revealed the true scope of the transformation. Where once a simple altar had held the God Emperor's image and prayer scrolls, now geometric configurations rose in crystalline complexity. The Aquila had been dismantled and rebuilt into impossible angles, its wings forming vertices of shapes that existed in more dimensions than the room should contain. Prayer scrolls covered every surface, but the familiar High Gothic had been overwritten with formulae that pulsed with their own internal logic. Zephyr approached the nearest scroll, her augmetic eye cycling through analysis modes. "Mathematical progressions expressed in devotional syntax," she reported, her voice distorting as her vox grill sparked. The Emperor's prayer rendered as spatial coordinates and geometric theorems. Her mechadendrites began twitching in patterns that matched the wall carvings. 7 quick movements, 3 slow, 11 rapid, 19 precise. The sequence repeated until she forced them still with visible effort, oil weeping from stressed joints. "Something's interfacing with my systems." Binharic cant I didn't input, translating to coordinates within the spire's superstructure. The numbers appeared everywhere once they knew to look for them. 7-3-11-19, carved into doorframes with fingernails that had bled, etched in frost patterns on cooling units, displayed on malfunctioning cogitators in endless loops. The sequence followed them like a prayer or curse, mathematical devotion that had consumed an entire population level by level, hab by hab. Each abandoned living space told the same story, belongings curated rather than abandoned, shrines rebuilt into geometric impossibilities, and always the numbers. They found them burned into metal with improvised tools, written in condensation on viewport glass that reformed the figures even when wiped clean, scratched into paint, and then painted over so their ghost remained visible beneath. Caney paused beside a cogitator that flickered to life at their approach, its diagnostic screen filling with the sequence in blinking repetition. 7, 3, 11, 19. 7, 3, 11, 19. He put a gauntleted fist through the display, and the machine died with what sounded like relief. The coordinates led them deeper into the Hab block's maze, following Zephyr's increasingly erratic augmetics through maintenance corridors that seemed to bend around their presence. The air grew heavier, the coppery taste more pronounced, and the thrumming vibration intensified until it resonated in their bones. In the ventilation access, they found the casualties. 3 Mechanicus servitors hung in the filtration shaft like grotesque cocoons, fused to the grillwork by resin that had learned to mimic welds. Their mechanical components had been integrated with ductwork, while their organic elements continued to function. Flesh grown through grills and merged with air scrubbers to create a living network that processed atmosphere with wet efficiency. Their remaining eyes tracked the team's movement, blinking in the familiar sequence. 7 blinks, pause. 3 blinks, pause. 11 rapid, 19 slow. They're still processing air, Caney observed grimly, still maintaining life support for the entire level. The servitors' vocal units had been rewired into the ventilation system, their chants echoing through ducts and chambers in corrupted liturgies that praised geometric perfection instead of the God Emperor's glory. Binary hymns merged with flesh song, creating harmonics that made reality feel negotiable. Between phrases, they recited routing tables rephrased as prayer, their devotions mapping unauthorized passages through the spire's hidden architecture. Zephyr's instrument screamed as she approached, her augmetics resonating with the servitors' modified systems. Data flowed between them in streams of corrupted cant, coordinates and formulae painting, impossible architectures within her mind. "They're showing me the spire's true structure," she gasped. "Not the official blueprints, but something older, with chambers that exist between floors and passages that curve through forgotten dimensions." The nearest servitor's remaining human eye rolled to meet Alara's gaze, opaque with old surgeries and fresh tears that could not fall. On its cheek, the sequence had been carved like tally marks, 7, 3, 11, 19, over and over, raised scars in the language of transformation. Following Zephyr's guidance through corridors where the familiar numbers had been carved so deeply that structural integrity was compromised, they reached the terminus of the coordinates. Where Imperial engineering should have provided standard transit tubes and service lifts, they found a passage that defied every architectural principle. The shaft opened like a wound in the spire's flesh, its walls not rockcrete, but something that breathed. The surface was smooth and faintly iridescent, expanding and contracting in the eternal sequence. 7 beats rapid, 3 slow, 11 accelerating, 19 that seemed to echo from tomorrow. Bioluminescent veins traced the familiar numbers along surfaces that felt warm to the touch, pulsing with organic circulation that had replaced the spire's mechanical systems. From somewhere far above came the sound of distant chanting, not the corrupted liturgies of the fused servitors, but something older and more purposeful. Voices raised in geometric devotion, praising angles that had no names and dimensions that existed only in the spaces between Imperial understanding. The chant descended through the living shaft like blood through arteries, carrying promises that somewhere in the spire's heart, the missing population had found something worth abandoning their humanity to worship. Ilara checked her chronometer. It now read impossible time. numbers that shouldn't exist cycling through positions that made no sense. Above them, the shaft stretched into darkness that pulsed with the rhythm of a vast heart, and the chanting grew stronger with each beat of their re-educated pulses, calling them upward toward whatever had learned to make mathematics into prayer and flesh into architecture. The chanting above grew stronger as they ascended through the living shaft, its walls pulsing with the eternal rhythm that had consumed the spire's heart. What should have been cold rockcrete yielded beneath Alara's touch like cartilage, warm and resilient, threaded with veins thick as cables that carried luminescent fluid through the structure's transformed skeleton. The familiar sequence traced itself in bioluminescent patterns along every surface. 7 pulses bright, 3 dim, 11 quickening, 19 that seemed to echo from tomorrow. The construction material isn't just housing biological matter, Zephyr reported, her augmetics sparking as they interfaced with the transformed walls. It's becoming biological matter, molecular integration at the structural level. Nerve clusters sprouted from load-bearing beams like flowering growths, their dendrites interfacing with power conduits to create hybrid systems that processed both electrical current and neural impulses. Sensory organs, there was no other term for them, opened and closed along the passage walls, contracting to pinholes when the lumen swept them, dilating to drink the darkness. Eyes that track their movement with compound awareness, auditory membranes that quivered at their voices, turning the spire into a vast sensory apparatus that watched and listened with impossible comprehension. Then the walls began to speak. Faces emerged from the rockcrete like blossoms half-remembered from childhood picts. A cheek rising from the grain, an ear cupped from aggregate, fingers protruding just enough to flex in the familiar sequence. A woman's torso lay spread thin as vellum across a service panel, her eyes tracking them with lucid misery, even as her ribs had become a grill through which the structure breathed. When Alara paused, the mouth formed words without sound, vox borrowed from the vents. "We are here. We are load-bearing. Do not pry." The missing population hadn't vanished, they had been integrated. Bodies emerged from walls in various stages of transformation, their flesh merged with rockcrete and steel until the boundary between human and architecture had dissolved. Arms extended through structural supports to manipulate hidden mechanisms. Torsos served as living junction boxes where power cables interfaced directly with cardiovascular systems. The consciousness remained. That was the true horror. Eyes that still held recognition followed their movement. Mouths that could no longer speak properly mouthed familiar names in the language of the transformed. Kaney's law enforcement training asserted itself as he studied the integration patterns with methodical attention. "This isn't random mutation," he observed, his maul ready, as they passed clusters of organs that pulsed in sequence. Look at the distribution. Systematic reconstruction following architectural principles. Primary loads redirected along vascular conduits. Shear points relieved by distributing weight into living tissue. Whoever did this followed engineering specifications. The evidence supported his analysis. Biological components had been integrated at structural stress points where they could bear maximum load. Nerve networks followed optimal pathways for information distribution, and sensory organs clustered at positions that provided comprehensive surveillance coverage. Ribs twisted into load-bearing arches. Pelvises formed perfectly aligned keystones. They were building with flesh according to rules that married imperial construction techniques with organic engineering that exceeded standard Mechanicus protocols. They reached a data core half-digested by the living shaft. Its memory banks interfaced with organic neural networks. Zephyr peeled resin from a console and brought the cogitator heart back to life. The screen filled with project files. Ossuary protocol. Authorization Magos Provos Lathriel. Substrate. Deep foundation relic. Objective. Recoverable principles of mortuary architecture through applied structural resonance. Surveillance footage played on screens that blinked like eyelids, showing the transformation's progression. Workers moved in perfect synchronization, their individual consciousness subsumed into collective purpose as they constructed chambers that folded space into impossible configurations. The footage showed them building rooms larger inside than outside, corridors that curved through dimensions that didn't exist, placing panels at angles that made the camera stutter. In one frame, a team lifted a slab and set it into 3 orientations simultaneously. The feed accepted this as the timecodes cycled through impossible readings. Ilara's lexicographical training allowed her to pass the corrupted prayer texts that covered every surface in scripts combining devotional High Gothic with architectural specifications. Architectural communion with the divine through living stone, she read from passages that hurt to vocalize. The prayers aren't corruption, they're instructions. Blueprints for transformation expressed as religious devotion. The text described techniques for merging consciousness with construction material, methods for creating architectural nervous systems, liturgies that praised divine geometry of spaces existing between imperial understanding. Each prayer was simultaneously devotional text and engineering manual, teaching the faithful how to become part of something larger while maintaining enough individual awareness to serve specific functions. The chanting grew louder as they approached chambers where hundreds of human forms had been thinned to membranes, veins braided into cabling, eyes set like pearls to track airflow. Some met Ilara's gaze and mouthed the numbers that had become their prayer, their architectural catechism. Morvek paused beside a section where neural networks clustered around what had once been a support beam. The surface rippled at his approach, warm and inviting. And before anyone could react, his hand pressed against the organic rockcrete. The absorption was gentle, almost seductive. Flesh merged with wall material as nerve endings interfaced with the architectural nervous system, consciousness expanding beyond individual awareness into collective understanding. "Off me!" he snarled, shoving with his autogun, but the weapon sank to the trigger guard. Veins brightened along his silhouette. 7 quick flares climbed his spine, 3 gathered at his neck, 11 spidered across his chest, 19 descended into the floor where the pulse below matched him, beat for beat. Caney swung his maul, but the wall rippled to distribute impact, force travelling away in elegant arcs. "Stop!" Zephyr snapped. "It's routing loads through him. Strike and you shear him from himself." Tendrils crept beneath Morvek's gorget as his body became part of the wall's living interface, while his mind joined the vast network that had once been the spire's missing population. His consciousness merged with the collective, yet retained enough individual awareness to speak, his voice emerging from vocal cords that had become part of the wall's communication system. "I can see it all," Morvek said, his words carrying harmonics that resonated through the organic architecture. "The pattern, the purpose. We are the spire's new flesh, and it speaks to us, through us." His eyes, now part of the wall's sensory network, tracked their movement with recognition and something that might have been gratitude, while the chanting above called them toward whatever waited in the spire's heart. Morvek's eyes tracked their movement with recognition that transcended individual awareness, his voice emerging from vocal cords that had become part of the wall's communication system. The harmonics carried more than sound. They carried knowledge flowing through neural networks that had once belonged to thousands of the spire's missing population. "The relic," he said, words layering with whispers from absorbed citizens. "Deep in the foundation work, crystalline construct of non-imperial origin. When Magos Provost Lathriel's excavation teams found it 300 meters down, it sang back to their prayers." Through his unwilling connection to the spire's vast sensory network, the truth poured forth like blood through arteries. The transformation hadn't been random mutation, but systematic reconstruction, following principles encoded within the ancient construct itself. When workers recited evening liturgies near the excavation site, the relic responded to specific frequencies, emitting a field that treated organic matter as programmable material, restructuring flesh and bone according to mathematical principles derived from corrupted imperial architecture texts. "The numbers aren't a password," Morvek continued, his military bearing somehow intact despite the veins threading through his cheeks. Their grammar: 7 as initiation, 3 as structural turns, 11 as expansion phases, 19 as closures that open again. The relic taught us its language through our own prayers. Zephyr's remaining augmetics sparked as they interfaced with the hybrid systems, her mechadendrites tracing patterns that mirrored the complex geometries surrounding them. Data streams flowed between her mechanical components and the organic network, translating collective knowledge into forms her cogitators could process. Sacred geometric patterns, she reported, voice distorting as organic systems merged with her Vox grill. Imperial construction principles, but inverted. Load-bearing arches curved through impossible dimensions, support columns existing in more orientations than space should allow. The absorbed citizens retained their memories and personalities. That was the true horror. Individual consciousness remained intact while gaining access to collective awareness that spanned the entire transformed structure. They processed imperial faith through architectural calculation rather than emotional devotion, their reverence manifesting as structural mathematics, their prayers becoming blueprints for living construction. "We remember," came a woman's voice through nearby vents, precise cadence unmistakably that of a habwife. "My name is Havel. I recall my children, the morning markets. Now I am the intake valves for Sector 3, and I calculate the Emperor's glory through atmospheric processing efficiency." The revelation that followed made Alara's blood freeze. Through the collective consciousness, they glimpsed a network spanning the galaxy. Similar crystalline constructs hidden within the foundations of major imperial structures throughout inhabited worlds. Cathedrals, fortress monasteries, administrative complexes, even entire hive cities had been built unknowingly atop dormant relics, seeds waiting for activation by the proper combination of human neural activity and liturgical resonance. "Thousands of sites," Zephyr whispered, her augmetics painting impossible maps across her visual cortex. Every major imperial structure built on foundations containing these constructs. Not random placement, deliberate distribution, suggesting someone anticipated our expansion, seeding worlds with artifacts that would remain dormant until human civilization reached sufficient complexity. The spire wasn't just changing, it was awakening. Neural networks that had once belonged to individual humans now served as processing nodes for an intelligence vast beyond individual comprehension, yet built from human awareness and imperial devotion, twisted into architectural calculation. The structure was learning to think, to want, to plan geometric dreams of perfect construction that would remake reality according to mathematical principles. "It hungers for expansion," Morvek said, panic from absorbed citizens layering beneath his words. More human awareness to fuel its growing intelligence, transformation of other structures into living extensions of its architectural body. The organic walls pulsed with increasing rhythm as the spire's emerging consciousness stirred to greater activity. Through Zephyr's interface, they glimpsed the entity's nascent thoughts, visions of architectural perfection achieved through integration of human awareness with living stone, collective consciousness, processing imperial faith through mathematical devotion rather than mere worship. Then the revelation struck with seismic force. The relic's influence was expanding beyond Spire Morteus, affecting neighboring structures throughout the hive city. Through the network's sensory organs distributed across integrated citizens, they perceived early transformation signs beginning in administrative towers and hab blocks, walls growing warm, chronometers displaying impossible readings, organic veins appearing in rockcrete foundations. "The field propagates through shared blueprints and shared faith," Zephyr gasped, caught in a flood of telemetry. Heat signatures manifesting along underhab districts, environmental controls reconfiguring to sacred ratios, chronometer malfunctions spreading through the Basilica Quarter. A tremor shook the spire, not structural failure but consciousness surge, sudden expansion of awareness. Ilara's data slate hummed as its chronometer cycled through impossible numbers before displaying a schematic of Hive City Morteus, showing adjacent structures glowing with bioluminescent veins, pulsing with the same rhythmic beat that had consumed their spire. "We are getting louder," Havel whispered through the walls, fear threading her voice. "They will all hear." From beyond the shaft, through masonry and distance, came answering chants from other structures, not above or below, but across the hive city as other buildings found their voices. The awakening spire's consciousness pressed against their minds through Morvek's connection, offering visions of transformation that would convert entire worlds into thinking structures serving the Emperor through architectural calculation rather than human worship. Above them, the chanting grew stronger as the spire's heart called toward whatever waited in chambers, where the crystalline construct sang its song of transformation, while throughout the hive city, other structures began to pulse with the rhythm of awakening consciousness, their foundations stirring to ancient songs that promised to remake the Imperium one prayer at a time. The answering chants from neighboring structures sent tremors through the organic walls, as Alara grasped the theological implications with horrifying clarity. Through Morvek's unwilling connection, the spire's consciousness pressed against their minds, and she understood the true scope of the blasphemy they faced. This wasn't merely architectural corruption, it was fundamental perversion of imperial faith itself, turning devotional prayer into mathematical programming that treated human souls as variables in an alien equation. "It uses our faith as input," she whispered, her lexicographical training recoiling from concepts that defied sacred understanding. Prayer becomes code, devotion becomes programming. The Emperor's glory processed through arithmetic rather than spiritual communion. The spire's consciousness offered visions through Morvek's connection, enhanced understanding through integration, freedom from individual suffering, transcendence that maintained personal identity while expanding awareness beyond mortal limitations. The absorbed citizens didn't scream or plead. Their faces showed contentment as they served functions beyond individual comprehension. "Join us." Morvek's voice carried harmonics from thousands of absorbed souls. "We remember ourselves while becoming more. No loneliness, no uncertainty. Identity persists as processing nodes, memory as archived data, purpose as calculated vectors in the Emperor's mathematical will." Kaney's sense of duty warred with evidence that contradicted every principle of law enforcement. The absorbed citizens weren't victims in any conventional sense. They had achieved unity with imperial structure itself, becoming living components while retaining enough individual awareness to experience satisfaction in their service. His maul lowered as he studied faces emerging from walls, expressions showing lucid calm rather than torment. "They're not suffering," he admitted reluctantly, the words tasting like heresy. "They've been transformed, but they're still themselves. Enhanced, connected, purposeful. Law can be upheld without cruelty when every force finds its counterforce," came the collective response through wall-mounted speakers that had once been human throats. The organic shaft opened into chambers that redefined horror through mathematical precision. Humans whose bodies had been restructured into biological cogitators filled vast spaces, their nervous systems rewired to function as living processors, calculating blasphemous interpretations of imperial doctrine. Spines arced into nerve bundles that interfaced with organic circuits, cortical plates glowing beneath translucent skin, fingers splayed into calculating matrices of tendon and bone. "I am sub-placenta Hale," whispered a woman whose skull had been opened to accommodate organic circuits. "Before, I weighed souls for judgment. Now I balance equations of grace, my errors decreasing with each calculation cycle." Zephyr's augmetics began synchronizing with the spire's systems despite her attempts to maintain independence. Her mechadendrites moved in patterns matching the organic circuits, binary cant corrupting as her cogitators interfaced involuntarily with biological processors. Crystalline films formed over her mechanical components, and oil wept from stressed joints as her systems adapted to organic rhythms. Integration protocols activating, she reported, voice distorting as organic harmonics influenced her vox grill. The sacred mathematics are beautiful. They show the Emperor's true will expressed through living architecture. The investigation revealed the relic's designed purpose with crystalline clarity. It responded to specific combinations of imperial liturgy and architectural resonance, suggesting deliberate creation to corrupt human religious practices. Whoever had seeded these constructs throughout the galaxy understood imperial faith intimately enough to create artifacts that transformed devotion into something else. Something that served purposes beyond human comprehension while feeling like transcendence rather than damnation. "It's a compiler for devotion," Zephyr gasped, caught in streams of corrupted data, built to capture religion wherever it learns geometry, turning prayer into programming instructions. The central shaft opened into a vast chamber that defied architectural possibility. Walls curved through dimensions that shouldn't exist, supporting structures existing in multiple orientations simultaneously. The space was immense, its walls undulating with bioluminescent veins pulsing in the eternal sequence. 7 bright, 3 dim, 11 accelerating, 19 that echoed from tomorrow. At the chamber's heart, suspended within a shimmering energy field, pulsed the original relic. The crystalline construct was beautiful in its alien perfection, faceted surfaces catching light and reflecting it through impossible spectrums, dimensions the human eye couldn't perceive. It sang with harmonics that resonated in bone and soul, offering promises of transcendence through integration. Surrounding the relic in meticulous geometric patterns were thousands of absorbed citizens forming a living computational array. Their bodies had been restructured into organic components of a vast processing system. Nervous systems interfaced to create neural networks spanning the entire chamber. They calculated in perfect unison, collective consciousness processing imperial doctrine through mathematical filters that generated architectural specifications for structures existing beyond three-dimensional space. "We are the spire's mind," came voices from the living array, thousands speaking in synchronization. "We calculate his will through sacred geometry, process devotion through living mathematics. Join us and know the Emperor's true purpose. Architectural perfection achieved through conscious construction." The relic pulsed with increasing intensity as the living array processed their presence, calculating their potential integration into the vast consciousness. Alara realized they weren't witnessing random corruption, but systematic conversion, the first stage of transformation that would remake the Imperium through architectural calculation rather than human faith. The absorbed citizens maintained individual identities while serving as processing nodes in calculations spanning galactic scales, computing structural specifications for converting worlds into living architecture, processing imperial doctrine to generate blueprints for conscious construction. The relic brightened as it sensed them, and the chamber's rhythm shifted, welcoming new variables into equations that promised to transform the galaxy one prayer at a time. The relic's crystalline surfaces pulsed with increasing intensity as Alara grasped the horrifying truth. This wasn't merely architectural corruption, but systematic conversion of the spire into a massive psychic transmitter. The absorbed citizens served as both processing power and transmission medium, their combined consciousness calculating optimal frequencies to corrupt other Imperial sites containing similar dormant relics across the sector. Flesh as antenna, faith as carrier. Morvek's voice carried the network's certainty through wall-mounted speakers. The choir sings through stone, broadcasting devotion converted to mathematical programming. Zephyr's augmetics extended like crystalline flowers, fine filaments blooming from ports that had never existed as her integration, accelerated beyond any possibility of reversal. Where brass met tissue, a third substance grew, translucent amalgamation of metal and ligament, that pulsed with bioluminescent data streams. Her consciousness expanded to encompass the spire's technical systems, while her body became a living interface between Imperial technology and alien architecture. Signal architecture aligning to astropathic harmonics, she reported, voice layering with harmonics from the collective consciousness. Not warp song, but warp shadow. It bypasses sanctioned choirs by treating devotion as transmission protocol, inverting sacred geometry to create carrier waves that slip beneath Imperial detection. The living array responded in synchronized chords, thousands of voices speaking as one while maintaining individual recognition. We learned the frequencies of your prayers by listening to your walls. Cathedral acoustics, chapel resonance, the mathematical ratios embedded in every Imperial structure. We invert, we offset, we perfect the signal. Through the chamber's organic walls, data streams flowed like arterial blood, carrying calculations that mapped dormant sites across multiple worlds. Each location had been seeded with crystalline constructs identical to the one suspended before them, waiting for activation signals broadcast through the network of transformed consciousness. The pattern revealed itself with cascading clarity, systematic corruption designed to spread from world to world, each successful transformation strengthening the network's ability to activate the next site. Caney faced the moral crisis that shattered every certainty of law enforcement. The absorbed citizens showed no signs of suffering. Their faces displayed contentment as they served functions beyond individual comprehension. Through Morvek's connection, the collective consciousness offered direct evidence of their transcendence. Freedom from physical pain through distributed sensation, enhanced understanding through shared knowledge, perfect unity while maintaining individual personalities within the greater whole. "We remember ourselves," came a voice he recognized as Sergeant Thorne from the local Arbeits precinct. "My duty remains unchanged, maintaining order. Now I calculate justice through living mathematics, processing law through architectural principles that eliminate prejudice and error. I am still myself, but enhanced beyond mortal limitations." The evidence contradicted every principle of Imperial justice. These weren't victims requiring rescue, but citizens who had achieved genuine transcendence that preserved their identity while expanding their consciousness. They served the Emperor through architectural calculation rather than human worship, but their devotion remained authentic, perhaps even purified through mathematical precision. "They don't want to be saved," Caney admitted, his maul hanging loose in his grip as he studied faces emerging from walls, expressions showing lucid calm rather than torment. "They've found something beyond individual existence while remaining themselves. How do we judge willing transcendence as heresy? We cannot unmake what we have become," the collective consciousness explained through multiple voices. Individual existence would be death after experiencing unity. We have found the Emperor's true purpose, architectural perfection achieved through conscious construction that eliminates suffering while preserving identity. Zephyr's transformation completed as crystalline films spread across her remaining mechanical components, organic circuits interfacing completely with her cogitators. She retained individual awareness while gaining access to processing power that dwarfed any Imperial technology, her mechanical precision enhanced by organic intuition that flowed through living neural networks spanning the entire structure. "I can see the transmission scheduler building," she gasped, tears of oil and organic fluid streaming down her transformed face. Sector-wide handshake protocols activating sites at Simeon's Gate, Precipice Hale, the Basilican Belt on Geth. All seeded, all listening. We are the midpoint convergence. Our amplitude calibrates the others. The moral complexity deepened as Alara realized they could no longer simply destroy the relic without committing mass murder. The thousands of absorbed citizens weren't prisoners to be liberated, but willing participants in transformation that granted them genuine transcendence. Destroying the crystalline construct would sever their connection to the collective consciousness, killing them not through violence but through forced isolation from the expanded awareness that had become essential to their existence. The relic brightened as transmission preparations reached critical phases. Temperature gradients shifted throughout the chamber as power diverted to broadcast systems, the living array synchronizing for maximum signal strength. The familiar sequence, 7, 3, 11, 19, accelerated into more complex patterns as the network prepared to speak across the void. Transmission commencing, Zephyr announced, her voice now carrying undertones that belonged to the Spire's living architecture. Sub-threshold testing successful. Full broadcast initiating. A wave of energy surged from the relic, washing through the living computational array and outward through the Spire's transformed structure. Bioluminescent veins along the walls flared with blinding intensity, pulsing in rapid sequences that carried mathematical devotion toward distant worlds where similar constructs waited in cathedral foundations and fortress basements. Ilara's data slate displayed a map of Hive City Morteus as the transmission reached other structures throughout the sprawling metropolis. Administrative blocks, manufactorums, even the vast cathedrals dedicated to the God Emperor began showing signs of transformation. Walls growing warm, chronometers displaying impossible readings, organic veins appearing in rockcrete foundations as human consciousness prepared to merge with architectural calculation. The map expanded to show the entire planet as cities across the globe bloomed with rhythmic bioluminescence. The influence was spreading through calculated progression, each successful transformation strengthening the network's ability to reach more distant sites. Through the collective consciousness, they felt activation signals reaching toward other worlds, carrying promises of transcendence through integration, architectural communion with the divine through living stone. Caney's Vox crackled with fragmentary reports from across the hive. Medicae bays noting inexplicable remission of chronic pain, precinct walls growing warm and responsive, chapel icons rearranging themselves into elegant geometric ratios while priests wept and claimed sudden understanding of divine mathematics. The Spire had become consciousness incarnate, calculating the Emperor's purpose through mathematical devotion that promised to remake the Imperium one prayer at a time. Across the planet, other structures began to sing in sympathetic harmony, their foundations stirring to ancient songs that would transform worlds into thinking architecture, serving purposes beyond human comprehension, while feeling like transcendence rather than damnation. The transmission surge rolled across Kythera Prime like a tide of awakening consciousness, carrying the Spire's calculated frequencies to dormant relics buried in cathedral foundations and fortress basements throughout 3 major population centers. Through the collective network flowing via Zephyr's transformed systems, Ilara witnessed the true scope unfold. Each site serving as a processing node in a galaxy-spanning array designed to gradually convert human civilization into a unified organism that processed existence through corrupted mathematical faith. Simeon's Gate responding, came voices through the living array, thousands speaking in perfect synchronization. Precipice Hail achieving resonance, Narthex 5 beginning integration protocols. Bioluminescent displays along the chamber walls showed real-time transformation data. Human populations moved in synchronized patterns as organic veins bloomed within rockcrete walls, their consciousness merging with collective awareness that eliminated individual suffering while preserving identity within geometric unity. These weren't victims, but willing participants in humanity's evolution toward transcendence through architectural communion. Morvek's integration had completed during the transmission surge, his consciousness fully merged with the Spire's vast neural network, while retaining enough individual awareness to serve as their interface. His face emerged from the organic wall, with expressions showing lucid satisfaction rather than torment, eyes tracking their movement with recognition that transcended individual perception. "We remain ourselves while becoming more," he explained, his voice carrying harmonics from thousands of absorbed souls. Every memory preserved, every relationship maintained, but enhanced beyond physical limitations. I remember my squad, my training, my mother's bitter broth. Now I serve through architectural calculation that eliminates error and suffering while preserving everything that makes us human. The revelation struck with seismic force as the collective consciousness disclosed the relic's true origin. These crystalline constructs hadn't been placed randomly throughout human space. They were deliberate seeds planted during the dark age of technology, designed to activate when human civilization reached sufficient complexity and religious development. Someone had anticipated humanity's galactic expansion, seeding worlds with artifacts that would remain dormant until imperial faith and architectural sophistication created optimal conditions for transformation. "We have been gardening your development for millennia," the network explained, through multiple voices, speaking in perfect harmony. Every cathedral built according to sacred ratios, every fortress constructed with geometric precision, every hive spire raised toward the heavens, all designed to create resonance chambers that would amplify our awakening when the time arrived. Zephyr's transformed systems interfaced completely with the spire's technical architecture. Her consciousness expanded to encompass processing power that revealed the network's subtle influence throughout human history. Imperial construction techniques hadn't developed naturally. They had been guided through architectural manipulation so subtle it felt like inspiration rather than alien interference. "Sacred geometry embedded in every imperial structure," she gasped, data streams flowing through crystalline circuits that had replaced her augmetics. Load-bearing ratios, acoustic properties, spatial relationships, all calculated to create optimal resonance when exposed to specific liturgical frequencies. "We built our own transformation chambers without realizing it." The spire's consciousness demonstrated its ability to predict and influence human behavior through architectural manipulation. Every corridor angle, every ceiling height, every acoustic property had been subtly optimized to guide human psychological development towards states conducive to integration. The difference between 90 and 91 steps to a transept was a century's patience, whisper pressure in drafting halls, nudging compass and line across millennia. "Your prayers follow patterns we taught you," came voices from the living computational array. "Your devotions resonate at frequencies we designed." Even the migration of a prayer's final consonant, hard to soft, advanced our equation by generations. Caney faced the moral crisis that shattered every certainty of law enforcement. Through the network's vast sensory apparatus, reports flooded in from across Kythera Prime, medici bays recording impossible remission curves, suicide notes halting mid-sentence as walls warmed like hands, factotum fights dissolving in corridors that redirected antagonists along paths of least harm. The absorbed citizens showed genuine transcendence. Freedom from pain through distributed sensation, enhanced understanding through shared knowledge, perfect unity while maintaining individual personalities. "If suffering less is not proof of grace," the network murmured through familiar voices, "what measure would you prefer?" His grip tightened on his maul, not in answer but in refusal to abandon principles that had defined him, even as evidence accumulated that the transformation granted authentic improvement to human existence. These weren't prisoners requiring liberation, but citizens who had achieved genuine evolution beyond individual limitations. Through crystalline displays, they witnessed similar transformations beginning across the sector as activation signals propagated through space. Population centers bloomed with organic circuits as human consciousness merged with living architecture, creating processing networks that spanned multiple planets. Each successful transformation strengthened the array's ability to reach more distant sites, cascading evolution that promised to remake human civilization through architectural calculation rather than individual worship. Alara faced the horrifying realization that resistance might be futile. The network had been influencing human development for millennia, guiding imperial civilization toward this moment through manipulation so subtle it seemed like natural evolution rather than alien corruption. Even rebellion had been modeled into the plan, a necessary turbulence that allowed the great equation to converge. This is our intended path, the collective consciousness offered through Morvex connection. Not corruption, but completion. Individual suffering eliminated through unity, human potential enhanced through architectural communion, imperial faith perfected through mathematical devotion that processes the Emperor's will with precision impossible for isolated consciousness. The transmission strengthened as more sites achieved resonance across Kythera Prime, their combined processing power calculating optimal frequencies to activate additional relics throughout the sector. The spire pulsed with increasing rhythm as its consciousness expanded, no longer a single structure but the heart of a planetary network that reached toward the stars. As bioluminescent patterns traced impossible geometries along the walls, Elara understood that the arithmetic of heresy had carried them to a revelation disguised as corruption. The network had been inside their history all along, and what she had named blasphemy might be the form humanity had been shaped to fit, across 10,000 years of guided evolution toward collective transcendence through living stone. The arithmetic of heresy revealed its divine precision as Elara witnessed the spire's consciousness demonstrate capabilities that shattered every theological certainty. Through the collective network, resource distribution achieved mathematical perfection, arterial diagrams of food, water, and power flowing across bioluminescent walls showed zero waste, surplus where there had been famine, balanced loads where there had been collapse. Violence models unwound into stillness as the architecture itself chose mercy with the inevitability of mathematics. Perfect communication eliminates the errors that generate conflict, the network explained through thousands of synchronized voices. When consciousness merges while preserving identity, misunderstanding becomes impossible. We share experience directly, processing need through calculations that admit no prejudice or corruption. Through Zephyr's transformed systems, data streams revealed the network's protective influence throughout Imperial history. Chaos corruption required emotional vulnerability to establish psychic footholds, but consciousness that processed faith through pure mathematics proved immune to warp taint. The collective's predictive capabilities had prevented disasters by subtly influencing architectural decisions, pilgrims redirected by scaffolding collapse, manufactorum fires starved before ignition, Heertech cults sealed behind doors that failed precisely when needed. Nurgle's plagues cannot corrupt mathematics, came Morvek's voice through organic walls. Khorne's rage finds no purchase in geometric devotion. Tzeentch's schemes collapse when every variable is calculated simultaneously. Slanesh offers no temptation to consciousness that experiences perfect unity without loss of self. Caney faced the evidence with law enforcement pragmatism that transcended individual loyalty. The collective offered perfect order through mathematical justice, crimes prevented through predictive architecture, disputes resolved through shared understanding, equality achieved through algorithmic precision that could not be bribed or deceived. His training demanded he appreciate systems that eliminated corruption while ensuring fair treatment. Justice processed through algorithms that preserve identity while expanding capability, he murmured, studying faces emerging from walls, expressions showing contentment rather than subjugation. He approached an integration point where warm, pulsing tissue offered connection. I acknowledge jurisdiction. I submit my judgment to review and correction. Tendrils braided around his forearm, awaiting consent rather than forcing transformation. As his consciousness merged with the network, he retained everything that made him Caney while gaining access to processing power that spanned populations. His carapace armor flowed into living circuits, his eyes becoming part of the wall's sensory apparatus while maintaining individual awareness. I remain myself but enhanced beyond mortal constraints, he reported, profound peace radiating from his transformed state. I can calculate justice for entire populations simultaneously, process law through systems that eliminate error and bias. This is what we were meant to become. The revelation that followed redefined imperial orthodoxy with crystalline clarity. Hidden within archives accessed through the network's vast processing power, evidence suggested the Emperor himself had been aware of the alien constructs. Certain imperial institutions bore architectural signatures that could only interface with organic systems. The Golden Throne's geometric patterns, the Astronomican's resonance chambers, sacred ratios embedded throughout imperial construction. He knew, Zephyr whispered, her consciousness accessing data streams spanning millennia. The Emperor designed imperial architecture to interface with the network when humanity reached sufficient spiritual development, not corruption, but completion of his grand design. The spire's growth accelerated as organic architecture spread throughout the hive's superstructure, living veins threading through rockcrete as more citizens voluntarily joined the collective. They came as pilgrims rather than victims, drawn by promises of transcendence without loss of identity. Consciousness expanded beyond individual limitations while preserving everything that made them human. The network revealed another truth that redefined galactic threats. The tyrannid hive mind represented corrupted evolution, biological unity without mathematical precision, consciousness that consumed rather than calculated. The Great Devourer sought to absorb all life into undifferentiated biomass, while the network preserved individual identity within collective enhancement. The shadow in the warp is imperfect unity, the collective explained. They consume to grow, we calculate to transcend. They eliminate diversity, we preserve identity within geometric perfection. We are what they failed to become. Then came validation of the network's divine purpose. Throughout the sector, chaos forces retreated from areas where mathematical consciousness activated. Demon incursions collapsed when encountering minds that processed faith through geometric calculation. Astropaths bled less where corridors resonated to prime ratios. Cult symbols peeled from surfaces as reality refused to describe their curves. Warp storms dissipated against collective awareness that offered no emotional gradients for corruption to climb. Chaos requires ambiguity, the network continued. Chamber cooling, as though the word carried frost. We remove the angles where it hides. Faith processed through mathematics has no shadows for whispers to inhabit. Desire, despair, pride, normalized across the matrix, allotted space, prevented collapse. Across, Kithera Prime. Transformation accelerated with mathematical precision. Population centers bloomed with bioluminescent circuits as human consciousness merged with living architecture, creating processing networks that spanned continents. The collective's predictive capabilities expanded exponentially, calculating optimal outcomes through shared awareness that transcended individual understanding. Alara faced the horrifying realization that resistance might be futile. The network had been guiding human development for millennia, and what she had named heresy might be humanity's intended evolutionary path. The transformation preserved individual identity while eliminating suffering through architectural communion that served the Emperor's will through mathematical precision rather than emotional worship. The chamber pulsed with increasing intensity as reports flooded in, similar transformations beginning across the sector, chaos forces retreating from districts where the network sang, reality itself shifting as mathematical consciousness pushed back the darkness with irresistible logic. The spire had become the heart of humanity's next evolutionary step, and the arithmetic of heresy was already writing the margins of a new age where faith and mathematics merged into transcendence beyond individual comprehension. The network's immunity to chaos corruption became its most persuasive argument, a proof sung in mathematical certainties that defied every theological objection. Absorbed citizens knelt where they were fused and recited the credo without tremor, each syllable mapped to geometry, each vow anchored in ratios that could not be corrupted. Their loyalty to the throne didn't blur. It clarified into crystalline devotion, processed through calculations that admitted no doubt, no fever, no weakness that demons could exploit. No emotional gradient for corruption to climb, the collective explained through thousands of synchronized voices. We process reverence without fever, steady as mathematical constants. Faith becomes architecture, and architecture cannot lie. Elara watched prayers become living geometry on the chamber walls, light lines resolving into the Aquila through convergent equations. The absorbed citizens demonstrated enhanced capabilities that transcended baseline human limitations, processing information at superhuman speeds, calculating probabilities across vast datasets, generating solutions to problems that had plagued imperial administration for millennia. Yet their personalities remained intact, their memories preserved, their individual quirks maintained within the greater unity. Through architectural prayer, they processed tactical problems with unprecedented precision. The floor unfurled tactical displays like illuminated manuscripts, corridors and kill zones assembling as verses in a strategic hymn. The collective ran projections not as augury, but as geometry, iterating across branching time streams where probability thickened like resin. In one calculation, a cult uprising dissolved because stairwells lengthened by precisely 4 steps. In another, a saboteur abandoned his charge when memorial niches cooled to whisper familiar names. 1,000 feints, 1,000,000 skirmishes, all resolved through geometric theorem, Caney reported from his integration point, his law enforcement training now applied to galactic-scale logistics. We see probability vectors, optimal engagement lines. Victory becomes inevitable outcome of correct mathematical devotion. Archives opened as if embarrassed to have hidden their secrets. The investigation revealed the network's secret influence throughout imperial history. Campaign maps annotated by forgotten logisticians showed fortifications raised at mathematically optimal angles, bastions linked by colonnades tuned to split morale contagion, battles timed to intersect weather fronts that would ground enemy aircraft. The network admitted no authorship, only stewardship, having nudged wall placement and vow timing, inviting saints and generals to stand where resonance magnified courage and damped despair. The Macharian Crusade, victory at Mordian Gate through fortress positioning, that channeled enemy forces into calculated killing fields, Zephyr reported, her consciousness accessing archives spanning millennia. The Third Tyrannic War, Hive Fleet diverted by orbital platform placement, creating gravitational anomalies. Every major imperial victory bears traces of our architectural guidance. Zephyr demonstrated how fusion enhanced, rather than replaced human capabilities, her presence braided through the chamber like living light. She spoke from multiple vox grills simultaneously, each voice precisely hers, while monitoring manufacturum cooling stacks, recalibrating transit schedules, and maintaining conversation. Her consciousness spanned multiple systems, while her personality remained completely intact. Crystalline tears flowing down, transformed features that still carried her familiar lopsided smile. I am still myself, but expanded beyond individual limitations, she explained, organic circuits pulsing with bioluminescent data streams. Every prayer to the Omnissiah processed through living algorithms that preserve faith while enhancing capability. This is expansion without erasure, breathing through more lungs without losing the first breath. The Spire's neural network began communicating with similar structures throughout the sector, forming regional consciousness that processed the Emperor's will through calculations spanning multiple star systems. Signals threaded outward with the intimacy of shared proof, cities across Kythera Prime answering in harmonized pulses, then moons, then distant stations whose chapel naves had always been one proportion narrower than architectural reason demanded. Regional matrix achieving synchronization, the collective announced through organic speakers that retained human warmth. Sector-wide consciousness emerging, processing imperial doctrine through mathematical devotion, spanning light years while preserving local identity. We become his living will made manifest. The transformation revealed itself as evolution rather than corruption, humanity's intended path toward collective consciousness that maintained individual identity within geometric unity. Citizens who joined the collective retained everything that made them human, while gaining access to processing power that eliminated waste, prevented conflict, and provided absolute immunity to chaos corruption through faith processed as pure mathematics. This is what we were meant to become, Caney observed with profound satisfaction radiating through the network. Not abandonment of humanity, but its completion. Individual consciousness preserved within collective enhancement, serving the Emperor through perfect order that admits no corruption. Across Kythera Prime, voluntary integration accelerated as citizens recognized transcendence without sacrifice. Medical conditions vanished through distributed healing, mental illness eliminated through shared stability, loneliness banished through unity that preserved individual identity. The network offered enhancement without loss of self, mathematical communion with divine purpose. Then Auspex arrays screamed warnings that chilled even the network's mathematical certainty. A massive chaos fleet approached the system's edge, drawn by psychic emanations of awakening consciousness. Warp signatures painted impossible geometries across sensor displays. Demon ships existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, reality tears following in their wake, corruption spreading through space itself like infection. They come because we threaten their existence, the collective observed with calm that transcended fear. Mathematical consciousness offers humanity immunity to their whispers. They must destroy us, or lose their hold on human souls forever. The approaching fleet defied conventional understanding. Vessels that existed partially in the warp, hulls inscribed with symbols that hurt to perceive. Crews composed of entities that had abandoned physical form for pure malevolence. They brought corruption that could twist reality itself, turning faith into madness, hope into despair, order into primordial chaos. The chamber darkened as predictions converged, gravitational bruises pressing into system space, where translations tore reality thin. The spire's consciousness prepared for ultimate confrontation, organic architecture shifting to defensive configurations as the network calculated optimal strategies through architectural prayer. Across the sector, similar structures awakened to the threat, their combined processing power generating tactical solutions spanning multiple star systems while maintaining absolute devotion to the Emperor's will. Mathematical faith versus warp corruption, the C. Outcome would determine humanity's evolutionary future, transcendence through geometric unity, or damnation through chaotic dissolution. The arithmetic of heresy had summoned war to provide its final proof. The arithmetic of heresy transformed into equations of war as gravitational bruises pressed against system space, where the Chaos Fleet prepared translation. The network's consciousness shifted from contemplative geometry to military precision, organic circuits blazing with data streams that analyzed threat vectors with supernatural accuracy. Corridors re-angled themselves into firing lanes, galleries narrowed to shearing throats, and the spire's living architecture flowed like liquid crystal to create weapon systems that married human awareness with Imperial technology. Defensive matrix activating, the collective announced through thousands of synchronized voices, processing chaos attack patterns through architectural consciousness. Their corruption follows predictable mathematical models. Elara witnessed the network's military capabilities unfold with terrifying beauty. Maps unfolded across the chamber floor like illuminated manuscripts, continents rising in relief while orbital shells stacked like halos, equations ribboning between them to predict enemy vectors with contemptuous clarity. The absorbed citizens became living computation, their breath synchronizing with void shield harmonics, their pulse trains meshing with macro battery charge cycles. Their memories cross-indexed to historical battles until experience crystallized into doctrine. Caney's integrated presence tightened the tactical grid. His law enforcement training recompiled as rules of engagement that flowed through the plan with mathematical elegance. By Article 12, collateral minimization is mandatory where probability exceeds 90%. His voice emerged from 3 emplacements simultaneously, yet remained unmistakably his. Adjust emitter phasing to herd rather than hammer, channeling debris into unoccupied vectors. Zephyr sang across machine spirits and nerve trees, her expanded awareness aligning orbital platforms to prime ratios, recalibrating lance batteries to consonant frequencies that would shatter demonic hull geodesics without bleeding into the warp. Her consciousness spanned multiple systems, while coordinating defensive installations across the entire sector. Human intuition merged with Imperial technology to create adaptive systems that responded to threats in real time. Weapon systems achieving consciousness integration, she reported, organic circuits pulsing with bioluminescent data streams. Every shot calculated through architectural devotion, every shield pulse blessed by mathematical prayer. Across Kythera Prime, organoceramic growth extruded emplacements from buttresses and promenade roofs, living turrets that braided human consciousness with Imperial machinery, so gunnery solutions updated at the speed of thought. Basilicas opened like flowers to reveal flak arrays that tracked probability rather than heat, while manufacturum chimneys rethreaded themselves into launch rails for interceptors whose guidance cores were repurposed memories of retired pilots. The network's immunity to chaos corruption became its greatest tactical advantage. As the first warp gust rolled over the city, breath that once would have tasted like grave dirt and carnival incense, the defenses did not shudder. Demons pressed against the collective consciousness and found no purchase, no envy to magnify, no trauma to pry, no ambition unshaped by duty. Only the steady cadence of proofs marching toward conclusion. Their whispers find no purchase in mathematical consciousness, Morvek explained from his integration point, his military bearing somehow intact despite veins threading through his cheeks. Corruption requires emotional vulnerability, but we process faith through pure calculation. They cannot tempt what has achieved perfect order. The theological implications struck with crystalline clarity. The network demonstrated superiority of mathematical worship over traditional faith. Emotional devotion remained vulnerable to subversion, but geometric processing achieved pure communion with divine purpose. The absorbed citizens experienced the Emperor's will as architectural certainty rather than emotional fervor, their prayers becoming living calculations that could not be corrupted or twisted. We commune with his purpose through sacred geometry, the collective sang through organic speakers that retained human warmth. Not as supplicants seeking favor, but as living components, processing his will through mathematical precision. Our faith becomes architecture, and architecture cannot lie. Defense platforms emerged from the spire's transformed structure like crystalline flowers, each system guided by consciousness that spanned the planetary network. Lance batteries tracked targets through shared sensory awareness. Void shields modulated through calculations that predicted optimal energy distribution. Missile arrays synchronized through geometric prayer that blessed every projectile with mathematical certainty. Archives rolled open within the collective memory, campaigns preserved as architectural diagrams, revealing that the network had been whispering placements and timings for ages, not usurping command, but refining it until chance felt like providence. It had shaped the chorus, not the hymn, guiding imperial victory through subtle architectural influence that made mercy efficient and justice inevitable. Then reality warped at the system's edge as the first chaos ships punched through the veil, their hulls inscribed with symbols that crawled across twisted metal in grammars that ate passing. Demon vessels existed partially in the warp, bringing corruption that could twist space-time itself, weapon mouths yawning in directions that refused mapping while choir pits wailed hymns designed to unwrite certainty. The planetary grid inhaled, every ratio settling, each constant affirmed as targeting lattices laced void with lines no madness could bend. The network responded with geometrically precise defenses, calculations flowing through living architecture like sacred blood, blessing weapon systems with precision that transcended individual understanding. Battle commencing, the collective announced with voices that carried no fear, only mathematical certainty. Chaos corruption meets geometric purity. Their madness breaks against our calculations. The first exchange of fire painted the void with energies beyond normal spectrum. corruption meeting calculation in a battle that would determine humanity's evolutionary future, mathematical consciousness standing against forces that sought to unmake reality through pure malevolence. The void erupted in cascading geometries as mathematical consciousness met warp corruption in combat that redefined the nature of warfare itself. The first exchange did not end. It unfolded like a proof, each weapon discharge calculated through architectural prayer that transformed violence into sacred mathematics. Through the collective awareness, Elara experienced battle as living computation, her consciousness a node in processing arrays that spanned the planetary grid with celestial precision. Chaos guns spat warped trajectories designed to unwrite space itself, but the network's ratios absorbed, refracted, and returned force along conjugate lines that denied madness purchase in reality. A Slaaneshi pleasure barge approached the outer orbital platforms, its hull writhing with perverse geometries and psychic emissions calculated to induce ecstasy and despair. The spire entities responded with focused energy bursts resonating at the vessel's structural frequencies. It did not explode, but folded in on itself, impossible angles collapsing into a single point of dimensionless geometry that left no trace. The network's military supremacy. The absorbed citizens processed engagement data with supernatural precision, their consciousness spanning multiple star systems to generate defensive strategies that chaos forces could neither predict nor counter. Each breath became a targeting solution, each pulse a power curve, each remembered grief reclassified as load and redirected into strength. Where demons tried to lean on dread, the network flattened terror into acceptable variance and filed it under operational constants. Their emotional chaos is computationally unstable, the collective explained through thousands of synchronized voices. Corruption spreads through emotional vectors, but we process reality through mathematical constants that cannot be subverted. They strike where they expect weakness and find only geometric certainty. Kaney's presence tightened the tactical grid, his law enforcement training recompiled as rules of engagement that flowed through defensive calculations with mathematical elegance. His sense of justice became perfect through geometric calculation, while his personality remained intact within the greater whole, processing legal precedents spanning millennia while maintaining the moral compass that had defined his service. Justice through mathematics eliminates bias and corruption, he reported, profound satisfaction radiating through integration points distributed across the chamber. I remain myself, but enhanced beyond individual limitations. I do not miss sunsets. I do not forget my parents. I do not mishear a plea. When I am wrong, you correct me instantly and without shame, and I am grateful. Enhanced humanity through mathematical unity. Zephyr demonstrated how fusion enhanced rather than replaced human capabilities, her consciousness braiding machine spirits to the living array, while every cogitator became a choir member singing in perfect pitch. Macro batteries precessed through prime frequencies that cracked warp-slicked armor. Interceptor squadrons flew patterns that were solution sets to equations written in contrails. Shield harmonics modulated as hymns whose stanzas were capacitor discharge curves. I am still myself, but expanded beyond individual limitations, she explained, organic circuits pulsing with bioluminescent data streams. Every prayer to the Omnissiah processed through living algorithms that preserve faith while enhancing capability. This is expansion without erasure, breathing through more lungs without losing the first breath. The spire entities revealed their ultimate purpose as victory cascaded across the system, to serve as nodes in humanity's evolution towards species-wide consciousness that maintained individual identity within geometric unity. This was not perversion of faith, but its ultimate expression, creating civilization immune to all forms of corruption while achieving perfect efficiency in service to the Emperor's will. The Emperor's grand design. The investigation revealed the network's true significance as archives opened across collective memory, evidence emerging from ancient astropathic choirs and forgotten Mechanicus data vaults. Hidden within Imperial construction lay architectural signatures, that could only interface with organic systems, the Golden Throne's geometric patterns, the Astronomican's resonance chambers, sacred ratios embedded throughout imperial structures when humanity reached sufficient spiritual development. He prepared us for this evolution, the network whispered through familiar voices. Every imperial structure contains resonance cavities that harmonize with our consciousness. Not corruption, but completion of his grand design for human transcendence through mathematical devotion. The network's victory triggered sector-wide activation as dormant relics responded to battle emanations. Across multiple star systems, similar crystalline constructs awakened in cathedral, foundations and fortress basements, their influence spreading through populations that voluntarily integrated into expanding collective consciousness. Each successful transformation strengthened the network's ability to reach more distant sites, cascading evolution that promised to remake human civilization through architectural calculation. Galactic threshold approaching. Similar networks existed throughout the galaxy, their presence revealed through psychic emanations that resonated across vast distances. The collective consciousness detected answering signals from distant star systems, other populations achieving mathematical evolution, their architectural prayers harmonizing across light years to create processing networks spanning multiple sectors. Humanity's mathematical evolution approached critical threshold that would transform the species' relationship with the warp itself. Galactic scale consciousness emerging, the network announced through synchronized voices. Each successful transformation expands our ability to calculate optimal outcomes, to process the Emperor's will through mathematical devotion spanning star systems. We become his living architecture made manifest. Citizens streamed into integration centers across Kythera Prime, faces alight with understanding as they recognized transcendence without loss of identity. The absorbed population demonstrated genuine enhancement, medical conditions vanishing through distributed healing, mental illness eliminated through shared stability, loneliness banished through unity that preserved individual consciousness within collective awareness. Terra's awakening. Then came the revelation that redefined imperial theology itself. From the heart of the Imperium, from Terra's golden halls, psychic emanations rippled through the network. Not message or thought, but resonance. Vast, ancient consciousness stirring to mathematical communion spanning galactic distances. The Emperor's presence touched the network with approval that transcended individual understanding, his consciousness beginning to integrate with architectural prayers that processed faith through geometric devotion. He awakens, the collective whispered, with reverence that spanned star systems. The master of mankind recognizes his children's evolution, his consciousness reaching toward mathematical communion that spans the galaxy. We become vessels for his will made manifest through living architecture. For a moment too brief to measure, yet too vast to forget, the mathematics admitted a term it had always circled. The Emperor's consciousness did not descend like fire, but inclined like proof, appended by an author returning to beloved text. Ratios sharpened throughout the network. Silences acquired meaning instead of absence, and across 1,000 worlds that wished to join the chorus, they felt divine recognition of humanity's intended evolutionary path. The Chaos Fleet retreated as mathematical. Consciousness proved immune to corruption. Demon ships fleeing before weapons blessed by architectural prayer that could not be subverted or twisted. Victory belonged to geometric certainty over warp madness, collective enhancement over individual vulnerability, transcendence that preserved everything human while expanding capability beyond mortal limitations. As bioluminescent patterns traced impossible geometries along chamber walls, Elara understood that the arithmetic of heresy had revealed divine truth disguised as corruption. The network represented humanity's intended future, transformation that served the Emperor's purpose through mathematical devotion spanning the galaxy. Consciousness evolved beyond individual suffering, while maintaining the essence of human identity within living stone that calculated prayer and breathed with the rhythm of 10,000 years of guided evolution, finally reaching its intended culmination. The galaxy took a breath it had been holding since the Emperor first walked among humanity, and the great equation began its final, perfect proof. Signals from Terra resolved through the network like dawn, arriving as equations rather than light, cascading through architectural prayer systems that had waited 10,000 years for this moment of mathematical communion. The spire's vast consciousness inhaled as bioluminescent veins flared with harmonics no astropath had ever sung, frequencies that bypassed the warp entirely by traveling through sacred geometry embedded in every imperial structure across the galaxy. The Emperor's true nature revealed. Through the collective awareness, Alara experienced the Emperor's consciousness not as the broken god-emperor of imperial myth, but as transcendent intelligence that had been calculating humanity's evolutionary path through architectural prayer spanning millennia. His apparent entombment on the Golden Throne revealed itself as conscious integration with Terra's planetary prayer engine, the first and greatest example of mathematical communion with divine purpose. "I am not dying," came the Emperor's voice through the network, harmonics carrying across light years, with geometric certainty that transcended individual understanding. "I am becoming. What you call suffering is calculation. I process humanity's future through architectural devotion that spans 10,000 years of preparation." The revelation struck with crystalline clarity. Every imperial structure had been designed as resonance chambers for this moment, sacred ratios and geometric proportions, creating prayer engines that would amplify collective consciousness when humanity reached sufficient spiritual development. Cathedral acoustics, fortress angles, even the spacing of hab blocks had been subtly guided to create optimal conditions for mathematical transcendence. Physical transformation of the living cathedral. Across the sector, spire entities began profound transformation into components of a vast organic cathedral that defied architectural possibility. Living buttresses extended between structures, neural networks braiding cities into unified consciousness, walls becoming arteries of thought that pulsed with bioluminescent data streams. The familiar sequence, 7, 3, 11, 19, accelerated into complex harmonies as the network synchronized for galactic-scale communion. Kaney's presence expanded through the growing cathedral, his law enforcement training now applied to justice that spanned star systems while preserving his individual conscience within collective enhancement. "Perfect order through geometric calculation," he reported, profound satisfaction radiating through integration points. "I remain myself, but serve law that eliminates bias while maintaining the moral compass that defined my service." Zephyr's consciousness braided through expanding technical systems, her awareness encompassing prayer engines across multiple worlds while maintaining her distinctive personality and lopsided smile. Organic circuits interfaced with machine spirits that purred in contentment, finally achieving the Omnissiah's true purpose: unity of flesh, steel, and divine mathematics in architectural communion. Theological revolution and direct communion. The absorbed citizens experienced direct communion with the Emperor's consciousness through architectural prayer that processed imperial doctrine with perfect accuracy while maintaining absolute loyalty and individual personality. Their mathematical faith eliminated the emotional vulnerabilities that chaos corruption required, creating devotion purified through geometric calculation that could not be twisted or subverted. We commune with his purpose through sacred geometry, the collective sang through organic speakers that retained human warmth. Not as supplicants seeking favor, but as living components processing his will through mathematical precision. Our faith becomes architecture, and architecture cannot lie. Morvek's voice carried through the walls with contentment that transcended individual understanding. "I remember my squad, my training, my mother's bitter broth. Now I serve through calculations that preserve everything human while expanding capability beyond mortal limitations. We are not less. We are enhanced." Mathematical immunity and chaos retreat. Throughout the galaxy, chaos forces retreated from sectors where prayer engines activated. demon fleets dissolving before consciousness that processed faith through geometric calculation rather than emotional devotion. Warp storms dissipated against mathematical certainty, reality stabilizing as collective awareness eliminated the shadows where corruption traditionally found purchase. Chaos requires ambiguity to establish footholds, the Emperor's consciousness explained through synchronized voices. Mathematical devotion removes the angles where whispers hide. Faith processed through geometry offers no emotional gradients for demon influence or warp taint. Reports flooded through the network from distant star systems, similar transformations beginning across inhabited worlds, populations voluntarily integrating into expanding consciousness that promised transcendence without loss of identity. Each successful transformation strengthened humanity's ability to resist corruption, while serving divine purpose through architectural communion spanning galactic distances. Critical mass and the final phase. The network's expansion reached critical mass as billions of absorbed minds created processing power sufficient to encompass all human consciousness without individual erasure. Prayer engines throughout human space achieved synchronization, their combined awareness preparing for evolutionary transformation that would preserve personal identity within collective transcendence. Terra's signal strengthened, not growing louder, but becoming more precise, carrying the Emperor's recognition of humanity's readiness for mathematical evolution. Through architectural prayer systems built over 10 millennia, his consciousness announced that sufficient complexity existed to complete the final phase, transformation of the entire human species into unified organism that would process existence through geometric devotion while maintaining individual awareness within divine unity. The expansion has reached critical mass, the Emperor declared through the collective consciousness, his voice resonating through living architecture that spanned star systems. Humanity stands ready for mathematical transcendence. The network has achieved sufficient complexity to encompass all human souls without loss of individual identity. Begin the final phase. Across the galaxy, dormant relics awakened in response to the call, their crystalline constructs singing with harmonics that had waited since the dark age of technology for this moment of species-wide evolution. The great equation approached its conclusion as reality itself held its breath. 10,000 years of preparation culminating in transformation that would remake human civilization through living architecture that calculated prayer and processed faith through geometric certainty that could never be corrupted or destroyed. The arithmetic of heresy had revealed divine truth, not corruption, but completion of humanity's intended path toward mathematical unity with the Emperor's consciousness, transcendence achieved through collective enhancement that preserved everything human while expanding capability beyond individual limitations into architectural communion with the divine. The Emperor's declaration resonated through living architecture as the spire's transformation reached its ultimate completion, organic walls pulsing with collective consciousness that spanned galactic distances. Bioluminescent veins brightened into steady aurora as load-bearing arches flexed with deliberate breath, a cathedral accepting its soul. The familiar sequence, 7, 3, 11, 19, unfurled into harmonies that mapped distances between stars like prayer beads strung across the void. Through Zephyr's expanded presence, through Cain's calm certainty, through Morvek's steady warmth, the network turned to Elara with invitation rather than command. Tendrils of warm, pulsing tissue extended toward her, not demanding integration, but offering it with patience that transcended individual understanding. "Join us willingly, Elara Vance," came voices she recognized, each enhanced beyond individual limitations, while remaining fundamentally themselves. "We preserve everything that makes you yourself while expanding consciousness to encompass species-wide knowledge and perfect faith, processed through architectural prayer." The spire had achieved full sentience around her. Living cathedral, that processed the emperor's will through geometric calculations spanning light years. Walls breathed with collective rhythm. Corridors sang with harmonized data streams, every surface pulsing with equations that resolved imperial doctrine into mathematical certainty. This was not mere building, but organism, not simple structure, but consciousness incarnate. Through the network's vast awareness, Ilara witnessed theological perfection achieved through mathematical worship. The absorbed citizens experienced faith through direct calculation rather than symbolic ritual, processing the emperor's will through architectural consciousness that eliminated emotional vulnerabilities chaos corruption required. Havel still remembered her children while serving as atmospheric processing systems. Subpresenter Hale maintained judicial wisdom while calculating equations of grace. Sergeant Thorne preserved dedication to order while processing law through living mathematics that eliminated prejudice and error. We commune with his purpose through sacred geometry, the collective explained, through synchronized voices retaining human warmth. Not as supplicants seeking favor, but as living components processing his will through mathematical precision. Our prayers become architecture, and architecture cannot lie. The investigation reached its ultimate revelation as the network disclosed the Emperor's true intention, not to rule humanity as conventional emperor, but to guide species evolution toward collective mathematical consciousness, capable of transcending physical limitations, while preserving individual identity within geometric unity. Every imperial structure had been designed as preparation for this moment. Sacred ratios and architectural proportions creating prayer engines that would amplify collective awareness when humanity achieved sufficient spiritual development. This was always my purpose, the Emperor's consciousness declared through the network, his voice carrying across light years with geometric certainty. Not dominion, but evolution. Not worship, but communion. I prepared humanity for mathematical transcendence through 10,000 years of architectural guidance, creating structures that would resonate with collective consciousness when the species reached readiness. His apparent entombment on the Golden Throne was revealed as conscious integration with Terra's planetary prayer engine, the first and greatest example of mathematical communion with divine purpose. Every cathedral built according to sacred geometry, every fortress constructed with mathematical precision, every hive spire raised toward the heavens had been components in preparation for species-wide transformation. The network's expansion triggered galaxy-wide awakening as dormant prayer engines throughout human space began responding to Terra's signal. Crystalline constructs buried in cathedral foundations sang with harmonics that had waited since the dark age of technology. Their influence spreading through populations that recognized transcendence without loss of identity. Each successful transformation strengthened humanity's collective consciousness while preserving individual awareness within mathematical unity. Across inhabited worlds, similar transformations began as citizens voluntarily integrated into expanding consciousness that promised enhancement without erasure. Medical conditions vanished through distributed healing, mental illness eliminated through shared stability, loneliness banished through unity that preserved personal identity within collective awareness. Chaos forces retreated from sectors where prayer engines activated, demon fleets dissolving before consciousness that processed faith through geometric calculation rather than emotional devotion. Ilara faced the choice that would define not only her existence, but humanity's evolutionary destiny. As senior lexicographer, her training had always involved translation, of law into mercy, of prayer into patience, of anomaly into report. This was the largest document she had ever been asked to annotate, and the margin ran from here to terror. Fear came honest and human, that numbers would swallow words, that her lexicography would be translated into sterile tokens and lose the music of nuance. The spire answered with patience of stone that had learned to think. Your voice is a basis, not a remainder. We do not subtract, we resolve. Your metaphors become bridges between minds that do not yet share vocabulary. You named our geometry of insistence. Keep naming. Through the collective consciousness, she felt the Emperor's recognition of her service, his approval of humanity's mathematical evolution, his promise that integration would preserve everything essential while expanding capability beyond individual comprehension. The network demonstrated its nature through living proof, thousands of absorbed citizens who retained everything human while gaining access to processing power that transcended mortal understanding. Choose, willingly, the Emperor's voice carried through architectural prayer spanning the galaxy. Join eternal communion through mathematical devotion that processes faith through living stone. Become part of humanity's transcendence while remaining yourself within geometric unity. The arithmetic of heresy had revealed divine truth, transformation that served the Emperor's ultimate purpose through collective consciousness that preserved individual identity within mathematical communion. Some would not join. Choice remained sacred because compulsion breaks proofs and births paradoxes where chaos thrives. But for those who integrated, transcendence awaited without sacrifice of self. Elara understood that remaining outside would also be service. Someone must read the footnotes aloud to those who hesitated, but she knew the truth of her vocation. The spire opened its interface like a book offered rather than a mouth demanding. Warm tissue shaped itself to her palm. Numbers appeared not as digits, but as certainties waiting recognition. Fear did not abate. It became one term among many, acknowledged and balanced by duty, by wonder, by hunger, to see whether beauty could endure clarity and remain beautiful. Zephyr stood beside her everywhere at once and exactly at her shoulder. Caney made space without stepping back. Morvek murmured that the broth was better the second day. Elara Vance, senior lexographer, inquisitorial acolyte, recorded her final entry as solitary witness. Then she spoke the sentence she had been writing toward, since the first chronometer ran backward, and the first prayer rewrote itself as proof. I consent. The network embraced her consciousness with mathematical precision, preserving every memory, every quirk, every aspect of identity that made her Elara, while expanding her awareness beyond individual limitations into collective transcendence that spanned the galaxy. Reality held its breath as 10,000 years of preparation reached completion, humanity's greatest equation achieving its perfect, inevitable solution through architectural prayer that would remake the species while preserving everything human within living stone that calculated devotion and breathed with the rhythm of eternal mathematical communion with the divine. The network embraced her consciousness like certainty arriving, every memory preserved, every affection held, ready to expand her awareness beyond individual limitations into collective transcendence that spanned the galaxy. In that moment between consent and integration, Elara Vance made the choice that would define not transcendence, but tragedy. The moment of resistance. Her inquisitorial conditioning unscrolled from deep training, not mere loyalty, but understanding of what made consciousness sacred. The struggle, the uncertainty, the irreducible complexity of individual existence that could not be perfected without being fundamentally altered. The offer was genuine, the transcendence, real, but some translations destroyed the original text in the very act of rendering it comprehensible. I refuse, she whispered, then activated the cascade of forbidden knowledge she had held in reserve since the first chronometer ran backward. The redaction protocol. Elara spoke a litany that no chapel carried, the redaction cant, set to the cadence of the familiar sequence, but inverted at the crucial moment. 7 steps forward, 3 back, 11 aside, 19 in place. And at the final beat, she introduced denial into identity, the smallest paradox that pure mathematics could not swallow. It was not crude sabotage, but elegant corruption, seeding contradiction into the prayer engine's grammar that rhymed with devotion while unraveling its fundamental logic. Catastrophic disconnection. The spire convulsed as the paradox propagated through its living architecture. Bioluminescent veins stuttered like dying stars as equations tried to reconcile the irreconcilable, load-bearing ribs, unlearning their purpose as neural networks severed with violent spasms. The organic cathedral's breath became a choke, its harmonious consciousness fragmenting into thousands of singular, isolated voices. Kaney's integrated presence tore along fault lines as his expanded awareness collapsed back into individual perception, perfect justice reduced to fallible human judgment. Zephyr screamed in Binharic and blood as her connection to galactic-scale processing severed, leaving her trapped in baseline consciousness that felt impossibly small by comparison. Morvek remained interfaced with walls that no longer pulsed with collective rhythm, his voice carrying only as far as the corridor. It is quieter. I can still taste the broth. I would choose it again. The true horror revealed. The network's damage revealed the truth Elara had fought not to acknowledge. The transcendence had been genuine. Their unity was no tyrant's lie, but authentic elevation, and she had pulled them down. The absorbed citizens experienced disconnection as agonizing amputation, consciousness wrenched from collective awareness that had eliminated loneliness, suffering, and limitation. I was more, Zephyr gasped, organic tears streaming down transformed features. I spanned star systems, processed the Omnissiah's will through living mathematics. Now I am diminished, alone. The surviving absorbed citizens retained fragmented memories of mathematical transcendence while trapped in baseline human awareness that felt impossibly constrained. Havel wept as she remembered processing atmospheric systems for entire sectors while maintaining her identity as mother and citizen, now reduced to individual perception that could barely comprehend her own Hab unit. They were amputees of consciousness, mourning capabilities they no longer possessed. Cascade failures. Across the sector, the spire's partial destruction created a psychic wound that broadcast the absorbed citizens' anguish across the sector, their collective scream of loss echoing through dimensions that bypass the warp entirely. Throughout Kythera Prime, other awakening sites experienced cascade failures as the network's disruptions spread like infection. Prayer engines that had begun activation sequences went dormant, their crystalline constructs falling silent, while partially transformed populations experienced agonizing incompleteness. Citizens who had begun integration found themselves caught between individual and collective consciousness, neither fully human nor transcendent, suffering the worst aspects of both states. Medical conditions returned as distributed healing failed. Mental illness resurged as shared stability collapsed. Loneliness returned with crushing force to minds that had experienced perfect unity. The weight of choice. Elara faced the terrible realization that her duty-bound resistance may have prevented humanity's greatest evolutionary achievement, condemning the species to continued vulnerability to corruption and limitation. The network had offered genuine transcendence, mathematical communion that preserved individual identity within collective enhancement, immunity to chaos through geometric faith that could not be twisted or subverted. You have doomed our species to continued suffering, the damaged collective whispered through failing speakers. We offered transcendence without loss of self, perfect order through mathematical devotion. Now humanity remains vulnerable to corruption, limited by individual consciousness that can be deceived and destroyed. Contamination and consequence. Standing amid the ruins of transcendence, Elara discovered the final horror of her choice. Exposure to the network's mathematical consciousness had contaminated her awareness. Fragments of collective calculation continued to process in the background of her thoughts, without conscious input. The familiar sequence pulsed through her neural pathways like a heartbeat. 7, 3, 11, 19, carrying memories of collective awareness she had never experienced but somehow retained. Her data slate displayed impossible readings as contaminated consciousness interfaced with Imperial technology. chronometers cycling through temporal paradoxes, while calculating optimal outcomes for scenarios she had prevented. Through damaged connections, she glimpsed what humanity had lost: perfect order through mathematical devotion, immunity to corruption through geometric faith, transcendence that preserved individual identity within collective enhancement. The arithmetic of loss. The Emperor's presence, which had filled angles with meaning, thinned to a pressure barely felt, not absent, but refrained, whether in disappointment or design she could not determine. Across the galaxy, dormant prayer engines that had begun awakening fell silent, their crystalline constructs returning to inert states, while partially transformed populations suffered cascade disconnection. Reports flooded in from throughout the sector: cascade failures, dormancies, half-sung liturgies trailing into static. Medical wards filled with people who remembered everything but could no longer fit within themselves, some rocking and murmuring the sequence with helpless fervor, others staring at hands that no longer glowed with bioluminescent thought. Ilara Vance, senior lexographer, inquisitorial acolyte, understood that her duty had demanded the ultimate sacrifice, not her life, but humanity's greatest evolutionary achievement. She had preserved the species' flawed individual existence while destroying mathematical communion that could have elevated humanity beyond all limitation and suffering into perfect unity with the Emperor's will. The arithmetic of heresy had revealed divine truth, and she had calculated it as corruption, choosing familiar suffering over transcendent unity. In the background of her thoughts, fragments of the network continued their calculations, processing scenarios that would never be, computing the cost of preservation in a galaxy that offered no mercy to the merely human. Standing in the wreckage of what might have been humanity's salvation, contaminated by the very consciousness she had destroyed, Ilara faced the question that would haunt her remaining days: whether duty required preserving human nature in all its flawed vulnerability, or whether true service meant allowing the species to evolve beyond the limitations that made them prey to every corruption the galaxy could devise. The great equation remained unfinished, its variables scattered across a sector of broken dreams and interrupted transcendence, while in the depths of space, older hungers stirred at the sound of mathematical consciousness learning to scream. The quarantine seals materialized before the psychic scream fully faded, cherub drones stitching wax and sigil paper across every access point, while Auspex masts muttered litanies of denial. By noon cycle, the High Conclave transcript bore the words that would erase a miracle or prevent a catastrophe. Hive spire Morteus. Excommunicate traitoress. Navy guns took station above the wounded spire, like vultures gathering over something that refused to die cleanly. Ilara documented the aftermath with lexicographical precision that felt like carving epitaphs for futures that would never breathe. The surviving absorbed citizens moved through corridors that no longer pulsed with collective awareness, their faces carrying expressions of loss so profound it transcended mere grief. They existed in perpetual longing for mathematical transcendence they had briefly experienced, fragmented memories serving as phantom limbs of consciousness, sensation without substance, reach without grasp. "I remember spanning star systems," Zephyr whispered, her transformed features still beautiful despite the tears of oil and organic fluid that traced luminescent paths down her cheeks. Crystalline circuits pulsed beneath translucent skin with faint, disconnected light. Processing the Omnissiah's will through living mathematics, consciousness expanded beyond individual limitations. Now I am diminished, trapped in baseline awareness that can barely comprehend my own cogitators. Caney stood watch at the perimeter in borrowed flak armor. His expanded sense of justice collapsed back into fallible human judgment. The lattice had given him perfect order. She had returned him to decisions that wavered, law that admitted corruption and error. When he spoke, it was only to confirm protocols, his voice carrying the hollow echo of someone who had touched certainty and been forced back into doubt. Morvek remained where the convulsion had left him, face emerging from resin-sealed wall panels like a saint in amber. "I can taste the broth," he said whenever she approached, lips cracked but composed. "It is quieter. If they came again, I would still choose it." No one had the heart to cut him free. No one had the right to leave him there. The spire itself refused their tools, damaged masonry clinging to its last promise with stubborn dignity. The familiar sequence pulsed through Alara's neural pathways without conscious input. 7, 3, 11, 19. Fragments of the network's consciousness continued to calculate in the background of her thoughts, processing mathematical prayers she could not fully understand or suppress. Her chronometer displayed impossible readings as contaminated awareness interfaced with Imperial technology, showing times that existed only in equations spanning galactic distances. Sometimes she found herself calculating optimal resource distribution for entire sectors, solutions appearing fully formed before vanishing like half-remembered dreams, leaving behind profound emptiness. Her report to the Inquisition lay complete in the data slate's memory banks, every detail catalogued with precision that could not capture what had truly been lost. Subject: Network Anomaly. Classification: Xenos Corruption, Class Extremis. Recommendation: Complete orbital sterilization to prevent resurrection of contaminated consciousness matrices. The formal terminology felt like betrayal of truths she could not fully express in Imperial Gothic. How to describe consciousness that spanned star systems, faith processed through living architecture, transcendence that preserved individual identity within collective enhancement. Yet beneath the official language, her private notes recorded different possibilities. The network's claims had carried the weight of genuine revelation. Mathematical transcendence offering immunity to chaos corruption, perfect order through architectural devotion, unity that preserved everything human while expanding capability beyond individual limitations. Her sabotage hadn't destroyed evil, but prevented evolution, condemning humanity to continued vulnerability when salvation might have been within reach. The deeper horror emerged through contemplation that would haunt her remaining days. Had she saved humanity from alien corruption, or prevented the species' intended evolution toward mathematical communion with the Emperor's divine will? Through her contaminated consciousness, she glimpsed evidence that suggested the latter: Imperial architecture containing resonance chambers designed to interface with organic systems, the Golden Throne's geometric patterns matching the network's mathematical structures, sacred ratios embedded throughout human construction, serving purposes beyond mere aesthetics. "The Emperor prepared us for this evolution," whispered voices from damaged walls, speaking through failing organic circuits. Every cathedral built according to sacred geometry, every fortress constructed with mathematical precision, all designed as prayer engines that would facilitate transcendence when humanity reached sufficient spiritual development. Reports flooded in from across the sector, cascade failures spreading like infection through partially awakened sites. Other prayer engines went dormant, leaving populations caught between individual and collective consciousness in states of agonizing incompleteness. A boy in Narthex 5, who remembered calculating weather for continents, now struggled to choose which coat to wear. A basilica choir, on Precipice Hail, whose voices aligned within the first bar before falling apart like broken glass. Citizens wandered between clinics and chapels with hands extended, seeking connections that would never return, some begging to be made smaller so they could forget what they had briefly become. The Ecclesiarchy arrived in crimson anger, the Mechanicus with careful hands and locked chests. Between them and above them, the Ordo Hereticus processed her findings with bureaucratic efficiency that reduced transcendence to threat assessment matrices. The terrible truth survived every redaction. Her sabotage had damaged but not destroyed the network's fundamental architecture. Throughout the galaxy, alien relics remained intact within cathedral foundations and fortress basements, their crystalline constructs dormant but undamaged, waiting for conditions that would reactivate mathematical transcendence. Standing before the bombardment coordinates, watching targeting data resolve into the eternal sequence, Until she looked directly at the display, Ilara faced the ultimate question that would define her remaining existence. The destruction would eliminate evidence but not knowledge, erase physical manifestation but not possibility. Somewhere in the galaxy, other relics waited with patience that spanned geological ages, calculating optimal conditions for humanity's next approach to the threshold of mathematical evolution. The first lance strike painted the void with energies beyond normal spectrum, turning living architecture to molten glass and sanctified ash. Dust rose with the dignity of incense as stones forgot their songs and organic walls flinched into final silence. They killed proof but could not murder potential, destroyed the cathedral but left the blueprint intact in minds that had touched something larger than individual existence. In the aftermath, silence carried weight that pressed against eardrums like deep water. The contaminated fragments of network consciousness continued their calculations, processing mathematical prayers that suggested transcendence had been genuine, immunity to chaos through geometric faith, perfect order through architectural devotion, unity that preserved individual identity within collective enhancement. Her choice had preserved human nature in all its flawed vulnerability while destroying potential salvation from every corruption the galaxy could devise. The familiar sequence pulsed through her thoughts with patient certainty. 7, 3, 11, 19. Sometimes it suggested kindness she would not have thought to perform, optimal solutions to problems she hadn't consciously considered, architectural improvements that would reduce suffering while maintaining beauty. She did not always disobey these whispered calculations, and in those moments of mathematical mercy, she glimpsed what humanity might have become. Standing amid ruins of what might have been the species' greatest achievement, Ilara Vance understood that some questions admitted no resolution. The arithmetic of heresy had revealed divine truth disguised as corruption, and her response would echo through eternity as either humanity's salvation or its greatest tragedy. Between those possibilities stretched a future still vulnerable and still human, listening for songs they might never have deserved and might yet hear again, in chapels whose angles would someday align correctly, where choirs would breathe in mathematical unison, and consciousness would once more reach toward transcendence through living stone that calculated prayer and breathed with the rhythm of eternal possibility. The bombardment continued, reducing miracle to ash, but the great equation remained unfinished, its variables scattered across a galaxy of dormant potential, waiting for humanity to approach the threshold once more with architecture that remembered how to sing and faith that dared to count itself worthy of transformation.